Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video about best practice Microsoft contract renewal preparation. My name is Dominic Mchugh, and I work on our consultancy practice here at Bytes, having worked with Microsoft licensing and contract renewals for about the last 15 years. And today I'm going to share with you 10 tips for success when preparing for your next renewal. While some of the tips I share today will cover specific areas that might not be relevant to your next renewal because of the technologies in scope, this is about establishing a repeatable methodology that you can use across any Microsoft contract. Equally, many of these activities are geared towards preparing for the renewal of multi-year contract, i.e. enterprise agreements, but some of the logic can apply regardless of what type of agreement you have in place. So what's first? Creating a robust renewal plan is the first thing that I would always recommend for customers. Now, I always get asked, how far in advance should we begin to prepare for the renewal? And I say, no amount of time can be soon enough, but typically I would recommend 12 months before the renewal date. This is in order so that we can create a roadmap of activities to span this entire time. So these will include things like strategy planning and technology evaluation. Who do we need to speak to within the business to determine what we're already using, what we're planning on using, what does our deployment roadmap look like? Making sure that we can implement any changes or even optimization measures prior to the renewal date. So if our strategy planning dictates that we have a slight change of licensing for certain parts of the business, have we got enough time to implement those changes? Making sure there are defined stakeholder engagement periods. So this is regardless of the area, everybody should have a say or an input into the renewal process. This could be C-level contacts, technical, architect and IT teams, procurement personnel, making sure that throughout the process, each stakeholder is consulted so that appropriate feedback is given and that feedback taken on board. Ensuring that we have time for an option appraisal, both with the licensing supplier and also time to appraise those options internally. If you're a non-public sector customer, then time for negotiation with Microsoft, and then also time to make sure that any commercial options have sufficient amount of time to be signed off internally before the renewal date. So let's look at some of the activities that will make up that renewal plan in a little bit more detail. So one of those is budgeting. Now, for multi-year contracts, pricing will undoubtedly change throughout the term of the contract, and this can be owing to a number of factors. The first of those could be the more recent biannual currency harmonizations that Microsoft announced, which are likely to take place in September and February each year. The most recent one we obviously saw was at the start of April 2023 here in the UK. Licensing changes take place throughout the course of the contract. So, for example, Teams rooms was probably the biggest, most recent change with regards to how a product was converted from one type into another. Dynamics and Power Platform as well have pretty regular changes. There are also product price changes to take account of. So, for example, in March 2022, there was a global product price increase for Microsoft and Office 365. What this will allow us to do is to create a baseline. And when we say baseline, there can be various iterations of this. And I would always recommend to create 3 versions of a baseline. The first of those being the current price that we pay in today's contract. That's our as-is position. Then overlaying the current license quantities we have with the current Microsoft list price at that point in time. And then if we are lucky enough to have any existing discounts within our agreement that have been provided on a concessionary basis by Microsoft, then also understanding what that current list price looks like with those discounts. The reason for that is the renewal price is likely to be somewhere between the values of options 2 and 3, and this gives you a good range within which to budget for the renewal. Obviously, that final value is subject to further negotiation with Microsoft, again, if you are a non-public sector customer. Engaging the business and the whole of the business is also key as part of the renewal process. And by this, what we want to make sure is that all of the stakeholders who have a say, whether that be from the technology standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, or even a more business use case standpoint, have the ability to engage and provide their input as part of this process. So it would be recommended to issue a communications plan and establish who within the business will be consulted at various parts of the process. So who will be affected directly by the renewal? For example, those negotiating or signing off on the contract renewal, those who will have to make any changes with regards to configuration or deployment of technologies, making sure that we've got stakeholder availability and buy-in to that project plan. And then finally, to make sure that we avoid releasing any unnecessary information externally. And a good example of that, for example, is if there is sensitive information relating to tenders that you might not want to release prior to a certain point in time. And by engaging the whole of the business, it means that we can also understand those users who may have projects that aren't typically within the scope of our traditional productivity stack of Microsoft 365, but they could be tools, for example, such as Viva, where we commonly see HR departments looking into how they may provide learning or collaboration platforms. We've spoken about strategy a couple of times, and this is key really to help in define what the final bill of materials and contract makeup looks like. But what we need to do within that period is ensure that there are documented and realistic deployment plans across all technologies, really for the forthcoming 3 years. So when do we think we're likely to deploy additional technology during that time? Do we have any POCs already in place? Are these confirmed or speculative requirements? Often is the case that we may find because a product is bundled into a suite, it's a case of, okay, we'll use that if we have the licensing for it. Again, we may put that as a speculative requirement. What we want to do is know exactly what's confirmed so that we can start to create cost scenarios based on different types of requirement levels. Have we got any upgrades of existing on-premise solutions that we need to factor into this roadmap? Are there any server decommissions and public cloud plans? What we want to really avoid, especially with regards to the server estate, is locking ourselves into multi-year software assurance renewals when some of these requirements may not be there after the first year, for example. Also, migrations to and from Microsoft products. So within this period, are we likely to see increased or diminishing requirements? And then also, what does our roadmap look like for support contracts? So again, is our unified support contract giving us value for money, and what are our support requirements moving forwards? Next is about understanding what licensing changes have occurred since our last contract went into signing, and is there any technical or commercial impact of these? So sometimes these can represent opportunities, but then also risks as well. So is there anything that we'll need to plan ahead of the renewal to make sure that we can configure products so that once the licensing renewal has taken place and the new product is in situ, we can make sure that we can transition accordingly. Is there any action for us to undertake now? Again, it could be testing, POCs, and finally, what happens with these products at renewal. So again, making sure that if we know what these changes are, we can then have a roadmap post-renewal to make sure that there is the ability to make those changes seamlessly without impacting the user estate. And a common example of that could be we're looking to change our Office 365 subscription level. Let's undertake some testing, make sure that the new subscription level doesn't cause any issues for the users, and then post-renewal, we have someone there to implement those changes to make sure that the new subscriptions are assigned accordingly. A little bit related to IT asset management best practice is the creation of a risk register. So your best practice would have regular license reviews as a core part of maintaining an effective ITAM strategy. So one thing to think about is how often do we review our compliance position throughout the course of the contract? I would always recommend that before finalising any renewal requirements, all existing risks should be known, and they should actually play a core part of your process throughout the course of the year. So common risks that we see ahead of renewal times are the use of Microsoft 365 tenant-based services that don't have adequate licensing. So for example, a setting that's been switched on that impacts all users within the tenant, but maybe none or only some of those users are licensed. SQL Server is a perennial risk because of the complexity and the options available to cover SQL servers. And more recently, the over-deployment of Azure Hybrid Benefit, because there are no forcible controls in place with regards to how you can switch Hybrid Benefit on, making sure that there is a sufficient amount of licensing available for that is a more recent risk that we've seen, and one that should be documented and known at all times, especially because typically those responsible for the licensing purchases may not have control of the Azure configuration or setup. Next is around persona definition. So this is a key part, especially for more complex organizations, in determining have we got the right set of licenses and is our estate right sized for our renewal. So is there a standard set of principles for determining license allocations for new starters? Many organizations now have a software asset management document which is written by that team that will define certain personas at the point of a user joining the organization. There will be a set of questions to say what type of device do they need, what applications will they need to access, and this will dictate the licensing that is provided to them. So any persona definition or review should include things like contractors and third parties, information or enterprise versus task or frontline workers, job roles. Have we got the ability to review job titles and identify opportunities for potentially giving users a different type of license based on their job title and true needs? Making sure that we review application usage. So what are our most commonly used applications? Typically in the Microsoft space, this would be Teams, email, OneDrive, Office. Are users using these applications? And if so, do we know what their usage looks like? How often are they using these applications? What type of devices do users need? More recently, Microsoft updated the minimum, or so the maximum screen size from 10.1 to 10.9 inches for the frontline worker plans. So understanding what types of devices users have is imperative to making sure that we stay compliant with these rules, as well as determining what licensing they should actually have based on their device size. And then finally, looking at some of those organizational wide security and compliance policies, as I mentioned before, in relation to tenant level services, and making sure that we know which of these features users will need to benefit from as part of their day job. Next is around optimization measures. And this can cover a number of different areas, but the most common that I think we see are the assignment of online services. So is our Microsoft or Office 365 estate as lean as possible in terms of license numbers? Have we looked at inactive accounts? So inactive accounts being made up of disabled users, accounts which are aged, or even accounts that have been unused for a period of time. What we should do is tie this in with the JML process to make sure that we can assess all of these different measures and make sure that, okay, we know all of our disabled users. If our JML process that says that we remove an account from a user from 30 days having left the business, then a license is removed. And what this can help us do is evaluate the processes internally to make sure that they are working, and also keep the license count to as lean a number as possible. With regards to Azure, is our baseline as lean as possible? And by this, we mean our run rate spend in Azure. So have we benefited from all of the reservations and savings plans which are on offer? Do we have licensing that we can use for hybrid benefit that we haven't yet enabled? Have we looked at all of our zombie resources, our idle services, and switched those off where appropriate or converted them to something else? Have we also right-sized and many of our other requirements? So, for example, development environments, Power Apps. Again, Power Platform, a more common item now, which has seen a proliferation of usage over the more recent months and years. But have we revisited some of those requirements, perhaps through a centre of excellence, to make sure that those users who have licensing today do truly need that license assigning to them based on usage? And a lot of these will be items that, once they're put into place for the first time, can be kept under continuous review. Reporting capabilities. So we spoke in section 6 about creating a risk register and making sure that any existing compliance or risks are known. But tracking assets and spend is also a key part of an effective IT asset management strategy. So what we want to make sure is, can we report on the following at all times: our on-premise infrastructure, so our Windows and SQL servers, all our end user endpoints, laptops, mobile devices, thin clients. We see our Azure spend and our cost management principles. Do we have a tool that's capable of reporting on all of these things? Can we identify what servers have got hybrid benefit enabled? And then also, finally, and definitely last but not least, Office 365 usage and license entitlements. Have we got an automated way of reviewing what licenses are assigned, going back to our JML process, seeing what our lean license number could be? Do we review these on a regular basis? Now, all of these will be key in order to help us establish what that final bill of materials looks like in terms of quantities. So whilst things like sections 3, engage in the business, section 4, around our technology plans, will shape the makeup of exactly what we should buy, making sure that we've got sufficient reporting capabilities will ultimately help us refine that final number that goes onto the bill of materials. And then finally, negotiation planning. So again, for those of you who aren't public sector customers, the negotiation section itself will come towards the end of the renewal timeline, and typically be in the few months preceding the actual renewal date. But planning for this should be made throughout. So understanding what negotiation levers we have to apply during that process. Typically with Microsoft, this is centered on increased commitment and buying new technology. Do we know exactly from our technology plans what this may look like? Again, about controlling messaging to the vendor. So we spoke before about keeping sensitive information internal only, but also making sure that there isn't any over promising in terms of technologies that we may adopt, because that could have an influence on the commercial process. What does success look like at the end of the process? And by engaging other stakeholders within the business, we can help to define exactly what this looks like. Now, success may look different for procurement, for C-level, or for some of them are more technical stakeholders, but defining what this looks like will help us during this phase to make sure that we can focus in the right areas and on the right options. And then finally, establishing who will conduct this part of the process. So again, going all the way back to our renewal plan at the beginning, making sure that we've engaged with the right people throughout the business and that they know what their role is as part of the renewal and when they have to play it. So for that person who is conducting that final part of the process with Microsoft, making sure that they know their role and what they'll need to do as part of that process. So hopefully those tips have been helpful, insightful for you today. Just a couple of further points around Bytes. Obviously, for those of you who are new to Bytes today, we are one of the UK's leading suppliers in terms of Microsoft licensing, with a multitude of accreditations and awards, with over 5,000 customers we've assisted in purchasing and, more importantly, decision making around Microsoft licensing and contracts. We do have, as I mentioned, within our consultancy services teams, a number of services which are available. We offer a commercial advisory services, which follows a process of due diligence, and many of the items within the methodology that I've just outlined to conduct some of these activities prior to contract renewals. And we also have managed services within our Cloud Essentials function, which looks at most of the cost optimization measures around online services, so Microsoft 365, Office 365, and Azure. So within that stream, there are a number of analytics tools and advisory services that can help with the BAU once your contract has gone into place, so that we can avoid waste throughout the contract lifecycle, we can procure in a more efficient manner, and we can also track some of that usage to right-size license allocations. If you are an existing Bytes customer, please feel free to contact your account manager if you'd like to discuss any of the points from today's video in any more detail. Or if you're new to Bytes, please contact the email address on screen there, tellmemore@bytes.co.uk for further information, or please feel free to look myself up on LinkedIn and send me a message on there. So with that, I'll thank you all very much for listening today. I hope that was useful, and hopefully we'll speak to many of you again at some point.